Hello everyone, Dr. Stevens here, and I want to help you out with Mr. Foster. Remember Mr. Foster? One of our books for this course, How to Read Literature Like a Professor. All right, we are using this book primarily during the first half of the semester, and so we need to know how to use it, which means we need to figure out what Mr. Foster is doing, what he's up to here in this book. So I want to say a few words about that, help you out especially with the idea of literary structure with respect to the quest, because we're going to be, one of our first assignments is to look at La Belle Dame sans Merci in terms of what Foster calls the quest. And by the way, that's not Foster's word for it. The quest is one of the universal patterns in literature. And so we're also going to be looking at that, patterns. But before we begin, I want to make a distinction between reading and interpretation. Now, the word reading is a tricky one. Ordinarily, it just means looking at print on a page and decoding it, right? Translating those words into whatever meanings those words have. Reading also occasionally has the meaning of interpretation, so it can be tricky there. There is this usage, if you will, of the word reading to mean an interpretation, as in, how do you read this particular poem? And that doesn't mean how do you say it out loud, and it doesn't mean how do you decode the meanings of the words. It means, what does this particular poem mean to you? But for our purposes, we are making a distinction between reading and interpretation. And reading simply means figuring out what the text literally says. Reading is not a matter of interpretation. It's not a matter of opinion. When you are reading in this sense, that is, figuring out simply what the text is saying, literally saying, all right, not what its different possible interpretations might be, but what it is literally saying, all right, that's what we call reading. Okay, so for example, go back to that poem by Keats, La Belle Dame. If you looked at the video in which I read the poem, I pointed out that there are two speakers. There is somebody in the first three stanzas who is addressing the knight. He says, "Ah, what can ail thee, knight at arms?" All right, thee is simply an earlier form of the pronoun you, isn't it? Second person pronoun. There's nothing fancy about the word thee. So we could say, paraphrase that as meaning, what's wrong with you, Mr. Knight at Arms? All right, so the knight is being addressed by somebody. Okay, and then I said, well, and then after we get to the fourth stanza, then we have the knight replying to that first speaker. All right, well, I met a lady in the meads, and so on. Okay, so he's telling a story. That is simply reading. That is discerning that there are two speakers there, right? Speaker number one and speaker number two. That's not a matter of opinion. You can't come along and say, well, Dr. Stevens, that's your opinion that there are two speakers there. I think there's only one speaker. No, it's just simply that is a matter of fact, okay? And that's the kind of reading that I'm talking about. Simply figuring out what we might call the surface of the text. What does the text literally say? All right, now let's talk about interpretation. Suppose you come along and say, well, Dr. Stevens, I know what you're talking about. There are two speakers here, or let's call them two voices. There's the voice of the knight, obviously, who's telling us this story. And then there's this voice, the voice of this other person, and we don't really know who it is because the person's not named in the poem the way the knight is named, right? The knight is called Knight in Arms, right? Okay. And suppose you want to say, well, Dr. Stevens, what I really think these two voices are the voice of the knight and the voice of the knight's superego, okay? I think that first voice is a voice inside the knight who is questioning the knight, all right? and asking the knight to look at his experience and explain the experience, tell about the experience. So I could say, okay, there are two voices here. I think they are two voices of the knight himself. The knight is talking to himself. One part of him, the super ego that sort of governs all of our impulses, right? What we might call our conscience, our sense of morality, our sense of self, that part of us that allows us to stand outside ourselves and look at ourselves and so on. I can say, okay, that's my interpretation. My interpretation is that first voice is the knight's conscience or the knight's superego, all right? That faculty, if you will, that allows us to stand outside ourselves and look at ourselves. That would be interpretation, okay? But the question of whether or not there are two voices there, two speakers, that's not a matter of interpretation, okay? So don't tell me that that's my opinion, that there are two voices. No, there really are, literally, two voices. Well, I hope you understand the distinction I'm making then between reading, okay, just simply seeing what the text is literally saying, and interpretation. Reading is unambiguous. It's a matter of fact. It's what is actually there in the text on the page. Interpretation then is a matter of, well, it's a matter of interpretation. Interpretation then is open to dispute. It is open to discussion. It's open to, if you want to call it that, opinion and so on. Interpretations then can be ambiguous. They can go in different directions, and of course, as I'm sure you know, for a poem there can be more than one interpretation, but there is not more than one reading. Understand? Okay, good. Let's talk then about literary structure. In his first chapter, and let's see if we can find that. In his first chapter, Mr. Foster tells us that every trip is a quest, all right? Now, what he's really doing here is he is talking about literature in terms of its overall structure. You might say its outline. And he gives us a little example. He makes up a story about a teenage boy who is sent to the supermarket to buy a loaf of Wonder Bread, and on the way he encounters another guy from the school, one of the cool guys, who's out with one of the cool girls, who is driving one of the cool cars, like the Barracuda. I don't know if you know what a Barracuda is. I'm not even sure if those were around anymore, but certainly when Foster was a high school student, that would have been a cool car, and so on. All right, he's making up a little story. And what he's asking us to do is then look at the basic outline of that story in terms of its elements, all right? Okay, so on the surface then, right? Getting back to what I was calling the surface, reading as opposed to interpretation, there's no question but what there is a boy, right? There's no question but what he's going to the supermarket. He's getting a loaf of Wonder Bread, right? That's his purpose in going to the supermarket. There's no question but what he sees this guy, what's he called, Tony and Karen, sees these people in a car and so on, all right? You know, that's not a matter of opinion. That's simply literally there. The question is, what then do these things amount to? And what Foster is doing is he's generalizing from these things. Okay, now he's getting into the area of interpretation, isn't he? He's generalizing from these things to a overall pattern of story that he calls a quest. And he says, all right, he says, and this is on page 3, he says a quest, you probably can't see this very well, so I won't try to make you read it on the screen, but he says there are basically 5 things. A quester, that is somebody, an individual who's going on a quest. All right, there is a place to go. Okay, where is this person going? There is a reason for going there. There are challenges along the way. All right, and let's see, challenges along the way, and then finally the 5th element here is a real reason to go there. Now, I have asked you in discussion to look at La Belle Dame sans Merci in terms of the quest. And what I'm asking you to do then is simply take this overall structure and see how it applies to that poem. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that it applies exactly, all right? But there may be, and I think there is a certain amount of overlap. There are some similarities between this general pattern of the quest and this specific story. Now, it is a story. The knight is telling us a narrative. He's telling us a sequence of events. First, I did this, all right, I met a lady. Then I did that, all right, I made a bracelet, and I made this belt of flowers for her, and then next thing I did was I put her on my steed, and the next thing we did was we went to her cave, and then, I had a dream, and all of these things. Okay, so it's a story, it's a narrative, it's a sequence of events that amount to something. All right, so there's no question about what it's a story. The question is, to what extent can we understand this poem better by looking at it in terms of that overall structure of the quest? So you're going to take these 5 elements, all right? You're going to see how they apply. Now, what are you doing when you do that? What are you doing when you take this general pattern of a quester and a place to go and a reason for going there and challenges and so on? What are you doing when you do that? Well, now you're interpreting, aren't you? Okay, good, good. And you've got a tool for the interpretation. You're not just going blindly at this, all right? You have got a tool called the quest pattern, if you will, and you're seeing how it will help you interpret this poem. One last element of the quest that Foster points out, and that I think you ought to use when you're thinking about La Belle Dame and how the quest might help you understand the poem, think of what Foster says about that real reason for the quest. And again, he brings this out on page 3 in bold type, all right? He says the real reason for a quest is always self-knowledge. And that is element number 5, or I guess it's letter E in his list of things here on page 3, all right? That element is the real reason for the quest, and what Foster is saying is that if you've got a quest, if you look at a work of literature and you say, okay, I've got a quest here, all right, then look for that element that we might think of as self-knowledge. Is this what is happening to the quester? You can do that with the Belle Dame, all right? In that poem, the quester is the knight, okay? I'll give you that. I don't think that, I'm not betraying any secrets there, right? Okay, you can figure that one out. The quester is the knight. The question for you is that the real reason for the knight's quest? And does he achieve some kind of self-knowledge? Okay, so, Mr. Foster, how to read English like a professor? Or how to read literature like a professor? All right. Good luck in applying that idea of the quest to La Belle Dame sans merci. See you in discussion, and thanks so much for listening.